So we're going to take a look. We're going to start thinking about how we merge two formulations together. And this is a little bit difficult. Well, it's not, maybe difficult might not be the right word. It's quite challenging. And I've never delivered anything like this before. I've never really talked about anything like this before in any workshops or training. This is quite heavy. This would be like third year therapy stuff on a postgrad course. I don't know how it's going to come across, especially with people who have got probably no theoretical background or foundation in therapy. So we're just going to have to see how this lands. We'll just have to be quite flexible with it and just take it in a stride, I think. I certainly have never applied any of this to a TV show, for instance. So I don't know how that's going to work. What we're going to do, I was thinking about how to frame this, and we're going to use what's called an interpersonal cognitive behavioral framework. Okay, so interpersonal, meaning more than one person, how people relate to each other and interact with each other. Thanks, Sarah. What, why are you nervous, Lana? I tell you what, I'll put this out there. I feel quite anxious about this as well because I've got no idea how it's going to go down. And I've got no idea if I have the ability to convey this information with very little background to it. So it's going to be interesting. So if you don't get it, it's not you, it's me. It's just pitched at the wrong level, but we'll see how we get on. So it's an interpersonal cognitive behavioral framework. It's interpersonal, how two people interact or two or more people interact. Cognitive behavioral, meaning there's an element of looking at their thinking and an element of looking at the behavior and how those also interact. The one we're going to use is a model by two researchers called Loban and Barakloff, and it was originally designed for involving relatives in helping people and family members who have got psychosis, essentially. So the model was based around this idea of having a service user and a relative. Okay. I don't know what people think about the term service user. Some people don't like it. It's commonly used. I tend to use it because that's what I hear in my circles, but it could be client or person seeking help or whatever. We just need some way to distinguish what part of the model relates to the person requiring help and what part of the model refers to the person who is providing some help. So in this they use the term service user and relative. Relative, it doesn't have to be a relative. It can just be someone with a close relationship to the service user. So it could be a close friend, it could be a partner, it could be a family member. Does that kind of set the scene so far? So it's a model, looks at how two people interact. It was originally designed for family members and who are trying to support someone in their family with psychosis, and how those two people interact. But it's since been broadened to apply to any kind of diagnostic problem, and it looks at how two people relate to each other. And I think what we'll do is we'll take our time with this. We'll go through the model. I'll try to explain it as best as I can, okay, without going too heavy on theory. The model has got a ton of links, as in links of how bits of the model relate to other bits. We might not talk about all of the links because that might get too confusing, but I can tell you that every link that is made in this model has an evidence base associated with it. And I've got access to that evidence base and I can show you the evidence base for every single link. Because I don't know if you've ever seen other therapy models, but quite often what happens is when a model is first introduced to clinicians, it comes from a research paper where that model is presented. And within that research paper, they talk about the rationale, how each part of the model relates to itself, and where the evidence for that link came from. So essentially everything's evidence-based within the model. Yeah, Sarah. So we're going to have person A essentially is the service user, person B is the known person. It'll probably be the other way around just because it's the way the model's laid out, the family members on the left. We'll see it in a minute. So, okay, can people see this? I'm going to be reading a load out as well, so you don't need to be able to read the text too well. Where is this going to pop up? Is it a different model used if the person with mental difficulties is one seeking help? No, this is a model with a person with mental difficulties seeking help. But this model's more about how they interact with the person, with the family member. So in this case, we would be thinking service user Jinx, family member Vi. So what we'll do, I'll explain this as best as I can. which will be interesting. And then there is, within the research paper that introduces this model, there is a short case study. So what I'll do, I'll introduce the links of how this all fits together. We'll look through the case study together, and that'll probably be most of the time, to be honest. And then I think once I've watched the next episode of Arcane, we can then come back and we can relate this to Jinx and Vi more specifically. I think that's going to be easier because then other people on Patreon would have watched this recording. I'll attach the paper that introduces a model to the description as well. And then they'll have an idea of how it's used. And then we can all take a look at it together. Like I said, I don't know how this is going to work. I don't know if anything like this has ever really been attempted before, especially with Arcane. It's relatively straightforward to do individual formulations. Where it starts getting difficult is when you introduce other people to it. So we'll see how we get on. So what we have here is we have this side relative here. So this is the relative. So this is going to be Vi's side most likely, and then this side is going to be what they call on the model the service user, which is going to be Jinx. I figured PowerPoint would be the easiest thing to use for this because I had to play with Word earlier and it wasn't as easy to move stuff around. Okay, so a service user, can you see my mouse? Yeah. So a service user in this box has a trigger, and a trigger can lead to an internal experience, such as having an hallucination, or it can lead to external events. And in this case, because this is built around psychosis, they tend to refer to hallucinations or delusions. Hallucinations, because it's coming from the person, and something internal is happening and it's manifesting as a hallucination, or external event, a delusion being like a belief you have about something that isn't real. Okay, don't get too hooked up on this. This could be any kind of experience. There's a trigger. Now, let me find my shapes because I'll need an arrow. So someone has a triggering experience. This leads to thoughts about the trigger. So there's what we call a cognitive appraisal. So what does this trigger mean? What does this trigger mean to the person? Does it mean that they think they are struggling with some kind of illness? Do they think they just saw something out the corner of their eye? Do they feel distressed by it? Have they had loads of hallucinations before and they're like, oh gosh, it's one of my hallucinations? Is it the first time they're having hallucination and they're really worried? So it's the appraisal of the trigger. And along with that appraisal, you get this idea of the ability to cope. Can I cope with this trigger? So something happens to me. Quite often what we think of is, can I actually cope with this? Do I have the resources to cope? And within this, you have, so you might have come across some of these things before. You have the idea of schemas. How do I make it a bit smaller? So you have kind of beliefs about the self and others. You can end up with information processing biases. We'll come on to that in a sec. And this can also lead to social isolation, where you either decide, I can't cope with this, I don't know what's going on, I don't know what to do, so I'm going to isolate myself. So say you have a delusion that everyone's out to get you, you might isolate yourself, or it can lead to support. Actually, I recognize this in myself, I know I'm not well, I need to go and get some support. And this is link one. This gets a little simpler now around this bit. Okay, normally the cognition bit is where people get a little bit hooked up on. If I find my double arrow, the shapes double. Right, so now we're into more kind of basic CBT work. So thoughts, what is going on inside your head has an impact on how you feel. So for example, I came into this presentation, well, it's not really a presentation, but I came into this kind of chat thinking, you know what? I don't know how this is going to go down. I don't know if people are going to get it. I don't know if I'm going to mega confuse people. I don't know if it's even going to relate well to Arcane or Jinx and Vi, but I'm just going to go for it. And I've been in positions like this before where I've delivered training. I've not thought it's going to go down well. And actually it's gone okay. It's gone good enough. So I have that thought and I think, yeah, you know what? It's probably going to be okay. So that leads to For me, the emotion of mild anxiety, but tolerable, like I'm in my window of tolerance, it's okay. Whereas if I'd had the thought, oh my gosh, I just can't do it. Everyone's going to think I'm like the worst therapist ever and I really suck. And everyone's going to leave the Patreon and none of this is going to work. And I get really caught up in that. My emotional and arousal level is going to be a lot higher. So we can see that thoughts have an impact on emotions. This also works the other way. So we know, for example, people with depression end up with loads of thoughts that are more biased towards negative things. Um, so we know that the emotion that you experience can have an impact on the type of thoughts that you have. Okay, that's kind of basic CBT stuff. What that means is there's a there's a link between thoughts and emotions. For those of you who know anything about CBT, then this is basic CBT stuff in this bottom bit. My arrow is too small to kind of fit in there. Um, but essentially, what emotion you're feeling can lead to a change of behavior. So if you're feeling depressed, you might not go out, you might not leave the house, you might neglect yourself, you might not get out of bed, or you might just go through the motions of the day but not feel anything. So, how you feel impacts your behavior. Likewise, your behavior can also impact how you feel. So, say you don't feel like going out and doing anything, but you do anyway, and you do something that's valued and meaningful to you, then that can then have an impact on your emotions. Yeah, one example would be in CBT, we have a intervention called behavioral activation. Behavioral activation is the kind of evidence-based treatment for depression. You get people doing stuff that's meaningful to them, even if they don't want to do it, then more often than not, it starts to improve their mood. Okay, because there's a link between behavior and emotion. That becomes link 3. We then have a link, unsurprisingly, between behavior and thoughts. Because you go out, you do something meaningful, and you think, you know what, that wasn't too bad. That was okay. It wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. The catastrophe didn't happen that I thought might happen. I survived. I came back, and has an impact on your thoughts. Likewise, as I'm sure you know, that your thoughts can have an impact on what you do. So I think I'm going to raise my left arm. I raise my arm. Okay. Thoughts and behaviors are pretty much linked. That's probably quite self-explanatory. This is now so this usually is an individual on is my mouse on there? Yeah. This is usually an individual CBT basic formulation. Okay. The only thing that's not in there is physical symptoms. So feeling your heart rate, noticing your breathing, those kind of things. But generally speaking, this is a basic CBT model. This is where it starts getting complicated now because you have to introduce another person into this. And this is where we might get a bit lost, but we're going to go for it. So what can happen is if we think about this column being our relative, I need an arrow. Okay, just try to stay with me with this bit. We put an arrow from the relative's behavior, and we're just going to have it floating here for now in between. Okay, so a relative's behavior can influence the content of schemas. Okay, so I'm just going to read a bit from the paper, and this will make sense. So it says when service users are surrounded by affection and they're surrounded by positive feedback, they are likely to see themselves as lovable and others as safe and a source of comfort. So that makes sense, doesn't it? Service users have great support from family members. The service user starts to see themselves as, I have some worth, I am lovable. These family members that I'm living with, they are safe, they're a source of comfort for me. So you can see how that can affect the schemas, the thinking styles, the beliefs of the service user. The knock-on effect of this is the presence of having those supportive people can reduce the social isolation, and they can help stop negative appraisals of events that might not be negative. So the service user could have the thought, oh, this really bad thing happened, but it's not actually a bad thing. It's just like a neutral thing. The family member can go, you know what, that wasn't actually bad. It was kind of neutral, and it can help balance it out. So it stops that spiral of negative thinking. Okay, so this is what happens when we have a family member or a relative or a close friend or a carer who's really warm and supportive and kind of caring. That makes sense, right? And the idea is that warm, environment, that caring environment reduces triggers. So effectively, the service user has a better mental health experience than they would without that person. Does this make sense so far? I'm just going to wait and just until a couple of people comment and say, yeah, okay. I mean, there's nothing kind of weird here in terms of how I've explained it. I don't think like this kind of makes sense. And now we kind of look at this from the other side. So where relatives are sometimes critical or judging or blaming, this can lead to negative schemas that the service user has about themselves. Okay, so we think about Jinx. This could lead to negative self thoughts, negative beliefs that Jinx has about herself. And what that can do is start to make the triggers feel worse because they have a trigger and now someone's got a belief of, I'm such a bad person. I'm never going to be better. There's no one here to help me. So that makes the trigger feel even worse now. That makes sense, right? What happens over time is that the service user gets so hammered by being criticized and judged and I don't know what else, criticized, judged, don't feel safe, belittled maybe, that generalizes out to other people, not just family members. So essentially, they think everyone's going to criticize them, everyone's going to judge them. No one is now safe to have a relationship with. That then starts, as you can probably tell, to worsen their mental health. In terms of psychosis, what we usually see is the worse mental health is, the higher the psychosis becomes, or the worse the psychosis becomes, the more prominent the hallucinations or delusions become. So, to kind of summarize that bit a little bit, a relative's behavior could act to reinforce the negative core beliefs about the self, the world, and the others. So, relatives behaving in a very critical way could reinforce beliefs about being useless, about the situation being hopeless, about being unlovable, about being worthless, about not being good enough, and that other people are also critical or other people could be dangerous. That can then lead towards, so I had this bit called an information processing bias. That can then lead towards uh, an information processing bias towards negative interpretations of other people's behavior. So you start to see other people's behavior as negative, even though it might not be, it might be quite neutral. So someone doesn't come around when they say they're going to come around. It might be because their bus is late. It could be because they couldn't get a taxi. It could be because their car's broken down. It could be that, they're just running late for whatever reason. They could have a really good excuse, but the service user's mind goes to, they've left me, they've abandoned me, they're not coming. Okay, that's an information processing bias because the service user doesn't actually know that. It's an appraisal that they've made based on their schemas. Yeah, so like Lars says, because you're a jinx, right? That's going to start building up a schema, isn't it, inside your head? And what happens is because they start seeing other people as unsafe, other people as dangerous, um, whether they are or not. So, for example, um, when Powder thought Vi had left her, but she hadn't, um, we know from Vi's perspective that she was going to go back. That can then lead to like withdrawal and avoidance and those kind of behaviors that we would see in someone on the service user side. So essentially, I don't feel safe. I have my schemas. I don't feel safe. Everyone's dangerous. Everyone criticizes me. Everyone judges me. I don't want anything to do with anyone else. I am now going to withdraw from society. I'm going to isolate myself because there's nothing else I can do. The other side of this is a bit more positive. So you could get supporting behaviors from the relative, and that actually reduces vulnerability to mental health problems. Because, like I said before, it can challenge some of those negative core beliefs the person has. So the service user doesn't get out of bed one day. They're just feeling really low, really depressed, just don't want to do anything. Then they could have a family member going, that's okay. We're here for you. Do you want some food? We'll bring you up some food. Like, just rest today and we can maybe do something tomorrow. Okay, that's going to start changing perhaps the schema of I'm worthless, I'm a waste of space, I'm not good enough to, okay, I've got people who care about me. Maybe I'm not all that bad. maybe I do have some value here. You can see that there can be a bit of a difference there. So warmth and supportive behavior can help to support more positive beliefs about the self. And then that can generalize out to others. So, hey, there's people here who care about me. Maybe there's other people in the world who are going to care about me. Maybe there's groups I can go to with similar people. And actually, I might connect with them because there's people here I'm connecting with. So you can see how that can help reinforce social interactions later on. This is good. So I like it when people are dropping in kind of arcane related stuff. Okay. It's really cool to see that. So this is our link 5. So I just need to copy 4. So this is link 5. So link 5 is really important because that shows how the behavior of a relative impacts the schemas and the beliefs that the service user has about themselves. And like you say, it's in the comments, you can see that from a Vi Jinx relationship, can't you? You can see that Vi's behavior directly influences how Jinx sees herself, especially early on. Okay, we're getting there. We're getting there. We're crossing over. This is good. Right. We now have link 6. Goes up here. This is fun. I get to like tell people who don't know anything about my job, like what I do. Quite like that. So 6 goes straight from the behavior of the relative to the actual trigger of the service user. And I'm sure you guys can come up with loads of examples. You don't need to, but kind of in your own mind, that there might be specific things that a relative does that may act as the direct triggering event. So it could be something the relative says, it could be something the relative does. It's in some way triggering for the service user. So this could be um, Jinx looking at Vi and Caitlin on the bridge and thinking that Vi has replaced Jinx with Kate. Yeah. So that behavior, as it's seen by the service user, has a direct trigger. And what's interesting about that is that it's actually an information processing bias because Jinx doesn't know that for a fact. That's how she's appraised the situation. We can also talk about other things I don't want to get into specifically in this, but we can talk about abuse and things as well. Okay. That's going to directly trigger um potential hallucinations and delusions in someone who's unwell, as I'm sure you can agree. I don't want to go near that because I appreciate it could bring stuff up for people. So we'll talk generally around it, and we'll relate it to Jinx and Vi as much as we can. I understand that this stuff's difficult, and I don't know people's backgrounds and things, and obviously I can't see people, so I don't know how they're responding to this. So I'm trying to be as sensitive as I can while still delivering information that's helpful. Yeah, like Carol says, the dinner sequence, we have more triggers from Vi. Yeah, because she's like Vi's really escalating things as well, isn't she? And you can see the reaction that's having on Jinx, and specifically in this model, which is looking at psychosis. So it looks at actually the trigger resulting in hallucinations. You can see how Vi's behavior is resulting in triggering hallucinations. So this is quite directly applicable, I think. This is why I want to kind of deliver this now so we can start applying it to stuff later on, because from what people have said, there's like some Jinx Vi stuff coming up. What can happen here is in this link 6 is once this behavioral link has been made, so there's a behavior and then there's a like there's a trigger event for the service user, which could result in a hallucination, then it takes less similar behaviors to cause that trigger again later on. I think that makes sense. So I don't know. So one way to put this now, every time she sees Kate and Vi together, they're together. She's been replaced every single time. Even if, they're physically further apart, because this link has already been established with that behavior, it doesn't take as long to trigger some kind of hallucination. Right. Can I do a bendy line? I'm gonna have to draw it. I can, if I can't find one, I'll get the pen and I'll draw it. There you go. Look at that. I can just draw the number now. Don't have to even copy and paste it. Right. I'll just use this from now on. It might get a bit scruffy. We'll see how we get on. So link 7. So this is a relative's behavior, as you can probably guess, can increase the negative emotion and arousal levels in the service user. You've all given loads of examples of that. Vi's behavior clearly leads to distress in Jinx, clearly. In the same way that, I don't know, when Kate and Vi are on the bed and Kate strokes Vi's face, that behavior can clearly lead to comfort in Vi. Yeah. So you can see a direct relationship between a relative's behavior or a carer's behavior or an intimate person's behavior to the other person. We then end up with link 8 because this um having this behavior and it causing this distress or this comfort feeds into your schema for the same reasons as we discussed before. Okay. Family members' behavior, really bad, makes me feel distressed. I don't trust family members. That goes on and on and on. I don't trust anyone. I don't trust my family members' friends. I don't trust strangers. I don't trust anyone. Flip that on its head, behavior, nice bit of comfort, nice bit of caring received. Okay, maybe I do have some self-worth. There is someone that cares about me. Maybe others might care about me. This, might not be as bad as I thought. You can see how that can impact on schemas. Where are we? 7. We now have the behavior going the other way. So we have 9. Isn't there like a guy on YouTube? Is his name Thor? He always uses paint. Oh, let me. No, Carol's asked a question. Hold on, let me find this. They're in the sequence, I think. Yeah. Did you ask a question after that? Good question. Oh no, sorry. Carol was saying at Noodle. Good question. Could positive behaviors turn to triggers based on the service user not believing them? Yeah, we'll come on to that in a bit. So essentially, it's not the behavior itself, it's the interpretation of the behavior from the service user. So although a family member or a carer or a relative, whatever, although they might have the good intentions with their behavior, it's the it's what sense of that behavior and the appraisal of it the service user makes is what's important. I think that answers your question. A really good question. Right, where are we? We can see here quite. This is probably quite obvious that a service user's behavior, so potentially their attempts to cope with their distress or their safety behaviors. So that could be things like, I don't know, self harm. It could be social withdrawal and isolation from the family member. It could be. It could come out as aggression. It could come out as arguments. That is going to have an impact on the relative. I mean, that makes sense, doesn't it? Hey, Alex. Yeah, it's probably easier to watch from the beginning with this one. But again, behavior that I'm trying to be cautious of my language here because I don't like using positive and negative behaviors because to me, all behavior is understandable. But you could get behaviors that look like caring behaviors from the service user to the relative. That would be quite calming for the relative. But I think in this context, we're probably thinking more about the service user's behavior being a trigger for the relative. So Jinx's behavior, she does something, it gets witnessed by Vi, and then it impacts Vi in some way. That makes sense, doesn't it? And again, coming back to who asked that question? Was it Noodle? A lot of this depends on the appraisal of this behavior. And so my understanding is family members who think that this behavior down here shouldn't be happening, like there's no reason for it, get triggered more by that behavior. Whereas family members who can understand why this might be happening are a bit more compassionate towards it, don't get triggered as much. And again, that makes sense. So because we're thinking about the appraisal that the relative is making about the service user's behavior, we end up here with link 10. And actually, what that starts doing, oh, that's not right, is creating schemas that the relative has about the service user. And then it can then start impacting on the relative who might say, I don't know what to do about this now. I'm going to isolate myself because I don't know what to do about this. Or they might be supportive towards this person, depending on what sense they make of this behavior. So if this relative thinks, you know what, that's really understandable that this person would act in this way when they're experiencing a hallucination. I really get it. I really want to help them. Then, as you would think, that leads to the relative being warm and offering comfort to the service user. They go into a supportive role. Whereas if the relative is thinking, they just shouldn't be acting like that. There's no reason for it. Why are they doing that? Why are they hurting themselves? They shouldn't be. It's wrong. That service user is going to get a very, very different experience from that relative. Just looking at the comments. So what happens is these appraisals, as we've just said, impact the behavior of the relative because they go, Jinx shouldn't be doing that. I don't get it. Why is she doing that? It's just there's no reason for it. She's wrong. She's bad. That's obviously going to impact the behavior of the person. We have 11. We have our two-way, because now we're kind of into an individual formulation for the relative now, because as soon as these thoughts start, as soon as they appraise the service user's behavior, they're into their own pattern. So we have 12, because now they could be not offering comfort to this person, and actually that's making them feel guilty, maybe. Or they've gone, oh, this service user's behavior, really understandable. I really feel for them. They're really struggling. That could lead to warmth and praise to that person, or warmth and compassion. And that can lead to kind of closeness and empathy. So that will make sense. And then we have the same link here. That can have an impact on their thinking. You'll be pleased to know, I think there's only 14 links. Oh my gosh, look at that. 3. What has happened? Has a spider walked across your page? That's what my old English teacher would be saying. Now we have this kind of weird bit, I think, where I think more things can start joining up. So we can have a line here that says that the behavior from the service user, it doesn't always have to start, it doesn't have to trigger something in the relative. It can actually just cause an emotional response. Yeah. So it might not go down the thinking and lead into this. The service user might do something and the relative just feels angry straight away. But because there's an emotional response there, it starts this loop here. So angry. I feel angry. Why did they do that? I feel angry. But now I'm angry. I might have an argument with them. So I'm having a behavior. And as I'm getting more escalated in my argument, it's impacting my thinking. They shouldn't be arguing. Why are they arguing with me now? Like they've done wrong. Why are they arguing with me? I get more angry and we see kind of an escalation. That's just one example. Yeah. So as you put it last, yeah. So it is like the whole thing is a feedback loop between two people, but also this thoughts, emotions, and behavior is also a feedback loop. And what you get to is the point that you try and offer an intervention at one of these points to try to break the cycle. So if this was just, let's say, you came to me last, I'm a CBT therapist, it's just you, it's not an interpersonal formulation. And we were looking at, I don't know, you're feeling depressed and you were having thoughts about feeling worthless, not being good enough. There's nothing out there in life for me. that was impacting your emotions, feeling depressed. Your behavior was you were laying in bed all day, not doing anything because, what's the point? Then we could come in and go, okay, so we can't just change your emotion because we can't just, outside of everything else, we can't just go, I'm going to be happy. And you're just suddenly happy without doing anything else. So the emotion is the outcome. The emotion is the thing we're trying to change. So what we could do is we could look at your thinking styles, your thinking patterns, look at what's happening with these thoughts in terms of why don't you think you're good enough? Why do you think you're worthless? We could look at how much um, kind of power you're letting these thoughts have on you, how much you're letting them control you. We could look at that side of things, or we could look at behaviors. So we could look at, okay, when these thoughts come, what are you doing? Are you listening to the thoughts and giving them the power that you think they deserve? Are you staying in bed? Are you doing anything else? So maybe there's an intervention point there of changing your behavior. And that's CBT, that's cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive just being a fancy word for thoughts. So this box here is the C, and behavior being the B. So we would look at those two boxes and try to find something that we could shift a little bit, just enough to get things going. That's basic CBT. So when I looked at this model earlier, I just made a few notes. I made a few notes that I thought were important, and one of them is what Noodle said earlier. So within link one, we're thinking about that it's the service user's perception of the relative's behavior is actually more important than objectively what the relative was doing. So this is exactly what we said earlier. So it's not what it's not what the relative does, it's what they are perceived as doing by the service user. And that's quite helpful when you do relational work, whether it's a couple, whether it's child parent, because the relative side, eh, they can get a bit skewed in their own behaviors. Like they think they're doing well and they are genuinely meaning well, but it's not coming across that way to the other person. And that's the important part, the appraisal the other person is making. I made some comments about link 9. So link 9 is the behavior from the service user going up to the relative. And I wrote, this is from the paper, excuse me. There is evidence that certain behaviors by the service user are more likely to elicit hostile responses from the relatives. So negative symptoms, so that being so positive symptoms are your hallucinations and your delusions. The negative symptoms are your neglect, your social isolation. So negative symptoms and violent behavior have been identified as likely to attract critical comments or hostility from relatives. Kind of made sense, doesn't it? Also, more recent changes in behavior and behaviors that persist are also viewed more negatively. So if a behavior is new, then I'm guessing because it's new and therefore it might not have as much understanding behind it, it's also rated as quite a the relative can respond in a hostile or critical way. So essentially, that leads us back into that kind of information processing bias. So what the relative thinks about the service user affects the relative's behavior. Long law, this model is actually used for like not individual therapy. Do you mean it's used in a way? So this model is used, it's used in practice. It's used to help relatives understand their responses to the service user. And it also helps the service user understand their responses to the relative and what keeps those responses going and what keeps people stuck. Because this is often quite new to people, like they don't understand the interactions between two people and how they actually impact each other and why. Interestingly, there's examples of link 13, which says that relatives who blame themselves for the mental health problems of their family member show higher levels of distress. So that's what you'd expect, isn't it? Right, that's an hour. Where are we at with this? Because what I want to do is move on to a very brief case study that's actually in the paper. just talk through that, and then we'll get a sense of what people think, and then that will probably be it. I think this makes sense, but then I'm coming at this from I have a very good foundation in therapy and in how stuff like this generally works. If you've never seen something like this before, it's probably really alien to you. It's probably like there's a lot. This is a complicated model to follow. So if you don't get it, it's it's not you. It's I probably haven't explained it very well. But it's hard. It's a hard model. And most models look like this. I don't know if you've ever seen kind of any other models. An interpersonal CBT framework for involving relatives for involving in interventions for psychosis, evidence-based and clinical implications. Onover's got a question. This is pretty straightforward. I did have a question before about whether the trigger needs to be big or just one after a long line of them. Yeah, so they I think they have an accumulative effect. So if you have a look back at this, then it doesn't have to be big. It's more about the I don't look at my math. It's more about the appraisal that is made about it. But repeatedly over time, that's what starts to create these kind of schemas and information processing biases. So maybe a one-off event, if it's small, might not be enough for a schema to change a schema or for an information processing bias, but small things over and over and over and over again could be. Or one big event could be enough to have an impact. Like I was in a car I was in a car accident once where someone drove into the side of me. Now I've been driving for, oh, I don't know, 43, and I started driving when I was like 18. And I've been in like 2 crashes. But when after this person had driven in the side of me, I found myself looking left all of the time, even times when there couldn't possibly be any traffic coming. Like there was something in my brain that was looking out for that threat and said, look left. I was always looking left. Like if I was at a red light and I wasn't even going, I'd be looking left to monitor the traffic to see if anyone was going to drive into me. And that was based off one event that probably happened 10 years after driving fine without having to do that every day. And just one event caused me for almost years afterwards to always look left. So you can have big shifts in behavior and big shifts in information processing just from one event if it's quite outside of the norm for you. I don't know if that's a very good example. No, I'm trying to just kind of pick things that I've experienced myself. Let's have a quick look at the case example that they give. I've not looked at this myself, so this should be quite interesting. It won't be based on Arcane, obviously. It'll be based on like a real relationship with people, but I think it might just lay out. It'll be interesting to see how the authors themselves have laid it out. So if I just can people see that? Is that okay? Right. So we've got service user John, and we've got mum Rita. So I'll read out some of the background. So John is a 35-year-old man who lives with his mother Rita. He has a part-time placement at a local organic gardening centre which supports people with mental health difficulties to get back into work. John's had a fairly happy childhood. He did well academically. John first experienced mental health problems aged 17 during his first job as a salesman for a phone company. He didn't enjoy the job. He found the target stressful. He was bullied by his line manager, who gave him a lot of negative feedback. This made him feel depressed. He started to miss work, making it even more difficult to hit his targets. John got more and more stressed as he felt stuck in the job because he wanted to help his mother financially by paying for his rent and food at home. Eventually, John stopped going to work altogether, became low in mood, and stayed in bed all day. So, a bit of background of John, 35-year-old, mental health difficulties, help people with mental health difficulties get back into work. He had a fairly happy childhood, did well academically, um, had a job as a mobile phone salesman, didn't enjoy it, found the target stressful, bullied by his line manager. That made him feel depressed, started to not go to work, which then made it more difficult for him to hit his targets. Got stressed even more, felt even more stressed because he couldn't help support his mum financially. Became low in mood to stay in bed all day. So John's mother, Rita, was both frustrated with him for not getting up, but also worried about his mood. At times, she would get angry with him and shout at him to get out of bed and get on with his life. At other times, she felt very sorry for him, tried to look after him by bringing him food and DVDs to watch. Rita became very anxious when she heard John talking to himself and suspected John was hearing voices. Eventually, Rita contacted the GP and John was assessed at home. Following a few weeks of visits by the mental health team, John was diagnosed at the age of 18 as having a psychotic episode and prescribed antipsychotic medication, which he agreed to take. Since this time, John has had periods of time when he feels well and is able to enjoy life and works as a part-time labourer for a friend's business. However, he's experienced several episodes in which his mood has become very low and he's started to hear voices again. These are generally triggered by an argument, a disagreement, or negative feedback from someone. These episodes have been managed by a combination of medication and talking to his care coordinator with whom he has a good relationship. On the whole, John has a good relationship with Mum. However, she's finding his episodes increasingly difficult to manage. The care coordinator has noticed that the levels of arguments between John and his mum greatly increase during John's episodes of psychosis, and these arguments were getting more heated over time. She felt this was having a negative impact on both John and Rita and shared this thought with them. They both agreed and were keen for some help to try and manage things differently. Right, we're nearly there. It's got a couple of paragraphs. So figure 2, that's the figure that you're looking at. Let me just check my OBS and that it's still up. Yeah. Okay, figure 2. So figure 2 provides a formulation developed by the care coordinator, which was based on the Interpersonal CBT Framework. So that's obviously the framework we've just gone through. This was informed initially by her discussions with John and his mum and her observations of the family dynamic over a period of 6 months of visiting the family. Once the family had expressed a wish to work on this issue, she met with John and Rita together and with each individually and asked them in greater detail about their perspectives on the problem. She developed the formulation jointly, so what you see in that diagram, by getting them to talk through recent difficult arguments and concerns and drawing out their thoughts, feelings, and behaviours during those times. The diagram highlights the interpersonal dynamic between John and Rita and shows how this is maintaining negative emotions for both of them. Rita feels angry and frustrated with John, which you can see in the bottom left box, when he withdraws from work and friends, as she can see that this makes him become depressed and the voice is worse. So in John's behavior, you can see he becomes withdrawn. She can't understand why he doesn't do things to make himself feel better and worries she will always have to look after him, which is exhausting as Rita also works long hours in order to pay the living costs. At the same time, Rita feels sorry for John and wonders if she is in fact to blame for his problems, as she is the person who brought him up. This makes her feel very guilty, and she wants to make up for what she sees as her own failings as a parent, and so she tries to care for him by doing all of the household tasks, which leaves her feeling exhausted. So you can see a maintenance factor there. Nearly there. John is very sensitive to his mother's frustration. When she is cross with him, it makes him feel more anxious and depressed. He wants to feel more independent, but at the same time is terrified that she will get fed up and will leave him. And so he continues to rely on her, partly as a strategy to ensure she stays. So that's the formulation. So it does give some intervention. Can you see my mouse on this? Yeah. So we have a trigger for John, which results in an increase in critical voices, commenting on failures. Increase in critical voices commenting on failures and intrusive thoughts that mum wants to get rid of me. That's the trigger. He has thoughts of I'm useless, I'm weak, I can't manage on my own, mum is going to leave me. That obviously makes him feel depressed and a bit anxious and a bit fearful. Those thoughts can also lead to behaviors of being inactive and withdrawn, listening to music to drown out voices that he's now hearing. That obviously has an impact on his emotion, and his emotion has an impact on his behavior. Him doing this, so him withdrawing into himself, has an impact on mum. So John's now not going to work because he's withdrawn. John's not helping around the house because he's withdrawn. but he's listening to music all day. So this behavior is a trigger for mum. Mum then has some thoughts about this. Mum says he's not even trying to get well. He's just inactive and he's in his room all day listening to music. It's not going to get better. I'll never enjoy my life. Maybe it's my fault. So we've got some kind of guilt thoughts coming through. I need to make him better. Those thoughts lead to mum getting angry, frustrated, guilty, and resentful. There's also a link to those thoughts from John's behavior. So there's a route to the emotion. It doesn't just cascade down from thoughts. Because mum's having these thoughts and this emotion, she does everything for John. And then she starts making critical comments to John and threatens to leave him. So her behavior there is a trigger for John. And because mum's saying, really critical things and I'm going to leave you, John gets an increase in critical voices, commenting on kind of how he's not worth anything and his failures. And then you can just see how this whole thing is just one big feedback loop. So it does. So to answer someone, I think it might have been last or someone who said, what do we do about intervention? There is guidance for intervention here within this paper. So it says the care coordinator, John and Rita, used the framework to identify things that could be changed in order to shift this interpersonal cycle from a vicious cycle. So this is called a vicious cycle because it's maintaining problems, to what's known as a virtuous cycle. So a virtuous cycle is one that facilitates positivity and improves things. So this is what they came up with. There's not many on here, so don't worry. There's behavioral strategy. So remember earlier, we were talking about how there's the B in CBT and the C in CBT. So B is looking at behaviors and C is looking at thoughts or cognitions. So there's behavioral strategies. John and Rita plan to spend more time together doing things they both enjoy to strengthen the positive aspects of their relationship. E.g., both Rita and John really enjoy cooking food. So this started with Rita teaching John how to cook some of his favorite dishes. And Rita agreed to support John to gradually take on more tasks around the house to build his confidence in his own skills. E.g., cooking together resulted in John cooking dinner one night a week. Rita was very impressed and able to share this with John, which made him feel great. I learned the opposite of vicious cycle. That's a good thing then. A virtuous cycle is one that's about growth. Then they looked at cognitive strategies. So these are thinking strategies. As John reviewed the skills he did have around the house and the new skills he was developing, he was able to consider his thoughts that he was useless and that he would not be able to manage on his own. John and Rita were encouraged to discuss their thoughts about the future. Rita was surprised to learn that John wanted to eventually live alone, but was anxious about losing contact with his mum, as he felt she was the only person who understood him. Rita was able to reassure him that if he ever did feel confident enough to live on his own, she would be nearby to support him. This gave John the confidence to develop his independence without fearing the loss of his relationship with his mother. The care coordinator spent some time individually with Rita to explore her thoughts about being to blame for John's mental health problems. Together, they reviewed the evidence available in written literature for the causes of mental health problems and considered the relevant events in John's life. Rita's causal model of John's problem changed from one in which her parenting played a major role and was to blame, to one in which she recognized John as having always been a very sensitive person who finds interpersonal criticism particularly upsetting. This was highly exacerbated by the trauma of his first job experience, and the stress of this caused John to become depressed and hear voices. This new model meant that Rita felt less to blame and was also more attuned to how her own interactions with John might impact on his mental well-being. Understanding his increased sensitivity to criticism resulted in her trying to convey any dissatisfaction with John's behavior in a more constructive way, and being more vocal in sharing her positive feelings towards any progress he was making. This resulted in a virtuous cycle, which was used to continue to guide progress. It does say there's a link to an online resource that's got that virtuous cycle, though I'm not sure where that is. I might be able to find it at some point because I'm looking at a PDF file at the moment. What do we think? Oh, I found the virtuous cycle. I've just managed to find it. Let me just show you it. So the virtuous cycle is this one. Oh, they've done it in PowerPoint as well. So this is the growth. Oh, hold on, not. Oh, it's on there. The growth cycle. So that's why we call it CBT usually in the interventions, because we try to target either cognitions or behaviors or both. So if we look at this, we've got a trigger. We'll just start up here. So a decrease in critical voices. So he's not struggling as much. He has a fun time with mum. He learns new household tasks. That leads to thoughts of, I can do some things for myself. Mum and I get along okay sometimes. So there's a little bit of realism there. That leads to an emotion of less depressed, less anxious, and a bit more confident, which leads to behaviors of being less withdrawn and spending more time with mum and doing more tasks. So we have this normal loop here that we'd expect. But this change in behavior here has an impact on mum. So John gradually attends more work. He takes on more tasks around the house. That leads to mum having some thoughts. He's trying to make an effort. I can see small but gradual improvements. I can help him as best as I can, but I'm not responsible for making everything better. Now, this shift leads to kind of less distress. It's still sad, but she's got some hope, and leads to a change of her behavior of now she's giving encouraging comments instead of critical comments, which you remember was one of his real triggering points, was receiving critical comments, which would end up triggering him up here. And she's supporting to build up an independence in household tasks and has more fun with John. And there's a direct link between the behaviors and the emotions. So her behavior has a direct link to how he feels, and his behavior also has a direct link to how she feels. So it all kind of makes sense. It works. It's a nice little model, this. Like everything, it looks relatively, what's the phrase? It's something like, it's simple, but it's not easy. Like, it's simple to see these things. It's simple to see these maintenance factors and these cycles, but it's not easy to change them. It takes a lot of work for people. It's hard and it takes time, but it's possible. So this is the model that I propose to view Vi and Jinx through. I'll leave links to all of this stuff in the Patreon. You'll be able to access it. What I'll do, I'll edit this video. I'll take out all the kind of spiel at the beginning, and I'll edit out all the large pauses I've had when I've been reading comments. So there'll be a much shorter video, and I'll leave all the links and that to this underneath, so people can check this out if they want to. If they want to kind of check it out in a bit more detail. But this is how I want to kind of look at Vi and Jinx over the next few episodes. So I want to look at how their behaviors impact each other's emotions, how their behaviors impact each other's triggers, look at any maybe critical points, maybe any points from me as a therapist that I'd be interested in as point of intervention, if, you know, they were up for it and they had access to a therapist. They're fun, kind of academic discussion points, though. How was that? So I did that in an hour and 22 minutes. We went through a lot and really quick as well. Yeah, it is a bit much, Obi. Yeah, it's one of these things that you could split up, but then you think it's probably best just to deliver the information and let people go through it in their own time. And especially if I give you the links and I can give you access to the papers and this PowerPoint as well. Like it's obviously up to you how much how much you care about it, how much time you want to dedicate to looking at it. But I think without giving an overview like this, it would be really hard to explain my thinking process later on, with the Vi and Jinx dynamic. And what I quite liked this one was about this one was that it was specifically designed with psychosis in mind, and it just seemed to fit quite well with what we see.